Okay, well, where'd it go?
I think it was shared with another screen. You have to do that top one. No? Oh,
Okay.
cool.
All right, here we go.
All right, everybody. We are going to talk about sadness today. So we're in week 4, and last week we talked about anger, which was the most expressed, which we talked about first because it's the most expressed emotion of all, and mainly because it is used to protect. So do y'all remember kind of talking about that? It covers up the feeling that we're not quite sure we're having yet, or we don't want to talk about. The next 2 feelings we're going to talk about are sadness and scared. Sadness is going to be this week, scared is going to be next week, which we might change that to fearful, so stay tuned. Because these are the 2 authentic feelings that are typically under the anger that we start out with by reacting with when we are actually hurt or scared. So again, the class format, we want to say understanding the emotion. We're going to spend about 20 minutes on. I think we're doing okay with that, but we tend to talk a lot. So, but we're working on it. And then the next thing is, of course, hearing God's emotion. So we like to bring in the Bible and talk about how God plays the most important part in us learning emotions and having them. And then third is we definitely want to discuss emotions. So if y'all have any discussion, questions, we've been having good discussions, so we've really enjoyed that. But to recap, we talked about anger last week. And what I wanted to do is just offer up to anybody if you had any experiences in the past week that you wanted to share. So just not so much, well, I got angry and this happened, but just noticing in your interactions or just seeing in somebody else's interactions, kind of understanding where they were pretty quickly because you learned how to think about anger in a different way. Anybody? Do you have anything?
I didn't get angry once all week. It was really fantastic. It's a first.
You don't ever get angry. I got angry about 10 times, but nothing really exciting. So just to be honest, it's out there. We have it, all of us.
Right now, I've decided that with our homeschooling with our 15-year-olds that they're drinking too much sodas, too much sugar, and too many snacks. So we've instituted physical education. And
It has been anger.
It has been a lot of anger at the lack of effort to follow through with what I'm telling them to do. So they're getting some extra miles. So some tears, some...
I actually can share because I am the one that pushes them a little too hard when they're running, and especially, I don't know what it is with my daughter. I'm like, you got to be tough. Like, you got to be a tough woman.
And I'm tough on my son.
So he's tough on his son, but I tend to be more verbal. And so the first time we're doing intervals, we're actually making them train. So they're hurting. And the first time we did it with our daughter, I was like a little bit more, I think I was harsh. And I looked back thinking I don't want to be that way. And so I kind of processed, why am I being so harsh? What is wrong with why I get so frustrated and I get angry? Because I wanted to push herself more. And it's because I get scared that she's not going to learn to be tough if she needs to be tough. And so I processed through that. And so this week when we did intervals, I promised myself before we left, I didn't say it out loud to anybody, but I'm like, I am saying nothing to her except positive reinforcement, and I am just gonna stay positive and I can't get angry. And I'll tell you what, it was much more enjoyable. She pushed herself more, and anger doesn't work. So it was pretty cool.
And that was not true for me. So I was positively pushing her in a positive way. So to keep running. So.
But the fun part is,
and James did excellent. So.
Yeah, but the fun part is after they ran, they get giddy and happy.
They conquered something.
And they really are proud of themselves. So just to let y'all know, we're not really mean. They actually do like what they're doing later. Yeah. So that for us, just kind of using that experience kind of helps not to be angry. All right. So we're going to go ahead and pray. Brian's going to pray us into the class so that we can have God with us.
Lord Jesus, we just call upon you to be with us and in our hearts, Lord, to hear your word, to understand you better, to understand so that we know how to communicate with you and how we can communicate with others better. Lord, work with Susan and give us her the message that can share your word and open our hearts to hear that word as well. In your name, amen.
Amen. All right, so do y'all remember this this I guess phrase or word, emotional terminology, from one of the first sessions that we had? We kind of introduced this in the very first class. I think that's when we talked about it. So we wanted to bring in emotional terminology. So some of the ones that does anybody remember any of those that we talked about? They weren't so much emotions, but how to process them and how you do it. Starts with an S. All right, it's sympathy. We talked about empathy. We talked about the upside down turtle, which was upset.
Don't use it.
Don't use it. And then when we say that, we use it all the time. So it's kind of funny. And then compassion, which compassion is basically active empathy, right? Like empathy with action. So all of these are just kind of tools in a way to use your emotions and notice them and use them in the right way. So today I want to spend a few minutes on a very important tool for emotional understanding and sharing between people and God. There are two important, what?
My slide messed up.
Oh, sorry, our slide messed up. There are two important parts to communicating: talking and, anybody? Listening. Listening. As we
the last 20 minutes are going to be fun.
They are. So as we've begun to talk about emotions in the last 4 weeks, including this one, I lost my place. We have tried to emphasize communicating your emotions. So communicating what your emotions are. If you do not understand and talk about your feelings, God and others cannot connect with you. So that's the part that I get frustrated at when I'm with my daughter and she's out running or doing anything. If I start to get frustrated, she just stops talking to me. And I think that's protective on her part, protective on maybe, I don't know, my part. But as soon as I calm down and she starts to talk, I know where she is. I know that she's actually listening. I know that she's having some kind of emotional reaction. And so then we can work on it from that moment. But if we don't know where somebody is, we can't communicate with them and connect with them. So listening is a big one. I guess I'll show you this book. I'm reading this book. This is really good. It's Whisper, and it's by Mark Batterson. And I actually heard Greg mention it in the sermon for other reasons, but I was like, I want to go get that book because it talked about something else I was interested in. But it just hit on emotions with God. And so, but first, communication starts with talking, like I said, but can only be effective if somebody is listening. With God, all you have to do is talk, right? Because he listens. And you can ramble, you can get out of context, you can make no sense, but if you just talk to God, he listens. So he's the best one to talk to because he doesn't need you to do it in a good way like we do with each other. We get frustrated when we don't know what we're saying. But what about when he talks to you? So what about when God talks to you? Do you feel capable of listening to him or hearing him? Like, can you hear God when he talks to you? So has anybody actually experienced hearing God talk to them? I have. I had one in case nobody answered. Mine is simple. Like I asked that question because God talks to people differently. I always tell people, like I've had a friend who was new to Christ and she kept saying, when do you hear God talk to you? I've never heard God talk to me. And I'm like, oh, I've never heard him really talk to me. But I know, and through how I know God talks to me. But I did have one time where God actually
yelled at you,
or his angel or somebody yelled at me. I mean, it was a verbal yell at me. I was 16. I borrowed my mom's car. She let me, but my dad did not want me to have the car because it was the nicer business car and I wasn't supposed to be driving that car, but I needed a donut. And my mom let me go get a donut when I was downtown with her at work. And I'm driving that car down a one-way street downtown Midland, Texas. There are no trees anywhere in Midland, Texas, but I was driving down the one street that had a tree over to the side. And I was like, how much is that donut? I think it's like 35 cents. And so I start digging for change. And at 16, you don't have a time ability to dig for change and drive. And so I just started driving looking for my 35 cents. And all of a sudden I heard someone yell my name. I mean, they yelled my name. I looked up and I was 3 seconds away from slamming into that tree. And I turned and got back on the road and just kept driving. I went and got my donut. I thought I definitely deserved the donut. But I don't know who yelled my name. I was looking down. And so to me, God allowed me to hear them say, look up, because one, I didn't want to get hurt. I didn't want my parents to divorce because I was driving that car. And so he did, he spoke to me. That's not a real deep speak, but he was there. And so I think that it's really important to figure out how God talks to you, because he does talk to you, whether it's in words, whether it's in music, whether it's in just quiet or whatever that is. God does talk to us. So we have to listen, and we have to learn how to listen in order to communicate back with God. So back to the Mark Batterson that I jumped out of order, obviously. It's called Whisper. So it's about how to hear the voice of God. And this is what I was reading along, and I'm like, oh my gosh, this is the coolest paragraph. It says, we shouldn't make decisions based solely on emotion, but we shouldn't ignore emotion either. In fact, one of the best ways to gauge the will of God is to discern whether or not the peace of Christ is ruling in your heart. And that requires emotional intelligence. God even spoke through emotions we can't put into words, such as the peace that surpasses understanding and joy unspeakable. To me, that whole thing is about emotion and being close enough to just hear what he's saying in my heart. I actually had a friend a couple weeks ago. I go, you know, when you hear that little thing, like you hear God talking to you, she's like, it's in my gut. He talks to me in my gut. And I go, he talks to you where? And she's like, in my gut, I know it. And I'm like, that's really cool. He talks to me like right back here. Like for me, it's learning where that is. So it's taking the time to get quiet so you can hear his whisper. And so that's listening. And it doesn't hurt to do that with your partner or your children or your friends either. That's we're learning to listen that quietly with God, then we can learn that quietly with people in our lives. The next thing that I got from the book was, you will eventually be shaped in the image of the loudest voice in your life, the voice you listen to the most, which is why we have jobs, why Sean and Emily have jobs, because a lot of people come in because they've got somebody else's voice in the back of their head telling them they're not good enough, telling them that they don't belong, telling them that they shouldn't go after that job because they can't. All kinds of negative stuff back there. Those are the voices that we have in our head. That's what we hear. But it's the loudest voice in your life. So we have the ability to choose who that voice is. And I choose God. And I have to work at it, because it's hard to have him be the loudest voice because everybody else is so loud, right? So that's from Mark Batterson from Whisper. Really good book. I love that emotional intelligence is in there. And before Brian moves it one more time, I just want to point out the first sentence where it says we shouldn't make decisions based solely on emotion. Of course not. But we also shouldn't ignore that emotion either, because remember, that's where it starts. The emotion is that we are here on the map, and then that's where we move. And that's where we figure out where to be. The emotion helps us with direction, but we shouldn't just go straight on emotion. So it's important to say that, because some people think emotion is how you decide. And that's kind of what gets a lot of people in trouble. Right. All right. So this was also in the book, but I remember seeing this. Whoever has ears, let them hear. That, of course, is by Jesus Christ. And he says that in Matthew 11:15, Matthew 13:9, and he says in Matthew 13:43. It is used 6 times in the gospel in just this way. And it's used 8 times in Revelation. So I think Jesus is telling us to listen. And he's telling us to listen with our ears. So, and then we had one other verse that we really, really like. Though you have not seen him, you love him. And even though you do not see him now, you believe in him and are filled with inexpressible and glorious joy.
That's the joy unspeakable, right? It's so hard to explain, but it's important. I think the reason this stood out to us is we're here to talk about sadness. And if you remember your feeling grid, the opposite of sad is joy.
That's just a sweet verse too. It's just a calm, peaceful, be quiet, and just try and find the joy in God, in Christ.
So Susan was talking about all this stuff and preparing, and then she shared with all this, and then I said, so how do you listen to God?
And I said, I don't know. He's like, yes, you do.
Yes,
I'm like,
do.
no, I don't. Tell me how I need to talk about it. So, but what I came up with, or what we were taught, this also came from a book too. This isn't just a book series class, but this is really how we started getting closer to God and making decisions based on
what God tells
wants
us
and tells us to do.
Since last summer?
Yeah, since last summer, which was about when we started at A&M Church of Christ in August. And it's basically, how do you listen to God? Well, one, prayer. And another way to think about prayer is to find your best friend and talk to him. Just spend time with him and talk to him and get to know him and be with him. Make him the best friend of everybody. He's more of my friend than Brian. I love Brian. Brian taught me that. Brian taught me that. He's like, God has to be before me. He has to be before the kids. You have to choose him to talk to first. That's, again, going vertical. Two.
And I was going to say, in John 15:15, this is what Jesus says. He says to his apostles, I no longer call you servants, I call you my friends. So Jesus wants us to think of him as a friend and talk to him in that way, in that manner.
Right. That's good memory.
Thank you.
Yeah. All right. Number 2 is read the Bible. Can't hurt. Definitely read the Bible and consult others who talk to God. Consulting others who talk to God is talking to godly people. There's nothing wrong with going to others to worship and fellowship. There is something wrong with going to others to tell you what to do, because that's you, between you and God. So I think we do tend to do that a lot.
And at the same time, I think God uses other people to communicate what we need to hear.
Right.
So it's again, back to that quote that I love, when you make God the loudest voice that you're listening to, the one that you're listening to him the most, that means sometimes listening to godly people around you so that you can hear God more.
Right.
Not just with you, but hearing God with others. So when someone else is called to a higher standard and they're talking about that in their life, maybe that's God talking to you. That's listening to other people who are engaged in that same kind of process.
Right. And that was actually, I think that was in the Tim Keller. I heard a sermon in the last week talking about, I think Tim Keller actually said, he's like, if you hear people say they talk to God all the time, go talk to them, spend time with them. If you know they pray, like my mom is a prayer warrior. And I used to just go, so what do you think about this, Mom? But then I realized I was asking her instead of asking God. And so, but as a prayer warrior, that's who you want in your life, because they are more attuned. Their line is much clearer to God and shorter maybe. So the second thing is read your Bible first. Second, consult with others. Third, watch for circumstances. You want to watch for circumstances that can either, and I kind of think of circumstances, for me, I'm more of a pessimist. I'm like, well, if there are a lot of roadblocks, that's the devil, and I'm supposed to do this because it's going to be hard for me to so it depends how you use those circumstances. You had a good example when we talked.
What was my example?
I can't remember.
Well, the one that just came to my head at this point was just thinking about what other things outside of your control are happening around you. So if there's something that you're wanting to have happen, but then there are circumstances that keep getting in the way, it's probably best to listen to that idea. It's probably best to not, that God is trying to speak to you. Oh, I had the joke, right? There's the old joke of
Oh,
the
yeah.
guy who lived under the bridge, and then there's a weather report that says, there's a flood coming and you should get out. And he's like, that's okay. I love the Lord and the Lord loves me. He'll take care of me. And then the waters keep rising and a boat comes by and they try and say, hey, get in the boat. You need to come. And he's like, no, that's okay. I love the Lord. He loves me. He'll protect me. And then the waters he's floating on a little raft and a helicopter is above saying, come on, sir. He goes, that's okay. The Lord loves me and he'll take care of me. And he dies. So then he gets to heaven and he's pretty upset with God about this whole thing. Hey, what's going on? Why didn't you save me? And he said, I tried. I sent a weather report, a boat, and a helicopter. So sometimes the circumstances we need to pay attention to because God's trying to speak that way to us.
Right. And number 4, it's called Get Neutral in this book. I have it here too as well.
Show and tell.
They're like on my bedside. Sacred Face. This is really good. So Get Neutral is you've done everything. You've prayed. You've spent time with God. You've spent time with Jesus. You've spent time in the Bible. You've consulted with those that God provides for you. You've watched for circumstances. And then you just get neutral.
Which basically means stop doing everything you're doing and wait for God to tell you.
Right. And you made a good point. He goes, so you can't move forward. You can't move backwards. You got to get quiet and listen for the whisper or how God talks to you. And you can't go horizontal anymore. You're just waiting for the vertical. So you're just waiting for the vertical to get the go ahead from God. And that is really hard because there are so many things that I can kind of say, I think that's what he told me to do. But if you say, I think, that means he didn't, because he's not confusing.
You will know.
You'll know. So that is our little bit of emotional terminology of listening and how do you listen to God? Because that's a hard question for a lot of people. I mean, almost everybody. And then Sacred Pace, that was by Terry Looper. That it's a pretty neat book. Sarah, that's one of those books. When you said that earlier, I'm like, I love this book, and I bought like 15, and I would give them to people, and I'm like, am I the only one that likes this book?
I'm sending one to somebody I talked to today. So
it's a really, I don't know, it hit me really well. All right, is this your turn?
Did you?
Yeah.
I don't know if you covered all that.
I don't know if I covered this, so I'm gonna say this. So first, what we do is you build, we did cover that. You build your relationship, spending time with God, Jesus, and the Holy Spirit, and this makes it easier to listen. But in order to listen, you have to slow down and get quiet. So you got to hear the whisper.
All right. So now let's specifically talk a little bit about sadness, right? This is the main topic. We know a little bit more about how to listen to God, but let's talk about sadness to try and understand the emotion itself. My training and experience, it trains me to listen for feelings, right? So when I'm attuned to try and listen when somebody talks about being feelings. And I can't tell you how many times I've been in a room where people are talking about how emotional they are and how great they are at expressing themselves. Are you pretty good with emotions? Oh yeah, I'm fantastic. And so they're just going on and on about how great they are emotions for 15, 20 minutes, and not once in 15 or 20 minutes have they used any word that is emotion based. All they're doing is telling me about reactions they have or things that are upsetting them. Upset, right? That doesn't work. So they're not using anything to help describe themselves. We have to listen to the sadness. We have to listen to that sadness because sometimes the sadness is in us and we have to pay attention to it. We alluded to this last week that anger covers up other feelings. There are underlying feelings underneath our anger, and one of them is sadness. It can look different for each person, but we have to listen for the sadness. First, we have to think about the spectrum of sadness, and we're going to look at the feeling grid here in just a moment. And I learned Susan taught me a cool trick, so you guys are going to be really excited about this. But we have to listen for the spectrum of sadness, right? And the spectrum goes from apathy. Apathy is the absence of feelings, but by definition, that is sad. Right? Those types of feelings under apathy are numb or indifferent. And so when we get to a place of hurt for an extended period of time, we become apathetic. Apathetic connects to hurt. Hurt connects to loneliness. Loneliness connects to depression. Depression connects to shame. Shame connects to guilt. This is the spectrum of sadness that we experience internally. But it's important to remember that we've used anger the wrong way. Anger is the opposite of empowerment, and it does not, does not protect. Sadness is what protects. When we used these examples before, when a child gets hurt and they go look for mom or dad, right? They're expressing their hurt, their pain, their sadness. And that physical pain is a reference or similarity to emotional pain. When we go and express that, then that physical pain they've experienced, well, then they get comforted. And that's the same way that sadness works. The best way to protect yourself is to own the sadness. We spend so much time avoiding that sadness, right? It's the fourth stage of grief. We've got anger, denial, and bargaining all before sadness. But when we are sad, the next stage is acceptance. So really, there's only two stages required for grief: sadness, then acceptance. But these other three, they get in the way. When we express that sadness, it protects. I have a funny metaphor. So if Susan and I went dancing and I took her dancing and I'm a terrible dancer and I start stepping on her toes, right? Literally stepping on her toes, it's going to create some hurt for her toes. So if she responds with anger while we're dancing, well, I'm sorry, that's the last dance she's getting that night, because there's no need to yell at me while we're getting dizzy doing some laps on the dance floor, right? So there's no reason to yell or do any kind of anger. Anger is not going to actually protect her. It's going to distance us in our relationship. So anger doesn't work. Yes, she might feel good, like she's protected herself. She's like, stop stepping on my toes, and yells at me. But that isn't the way to protect. The way to protect it goes, ow, that hurts. Your gigantic feet and your big old boots are stepping on my toes. Oh my gosh, I didn't know. So you are making me aware that how I'm dancing, which is awesome, is affecting your comfort level. So sadness, hurt, expressing that is the best way to actually be protected. Now I get to change my style of dance, right? And it'll stay awesome. But my dance moves will have to grow, I guess you could say. I also want to make the distinction between shame and guilt. We tend to misuse these words a lot. They're misunderstood in how we apply them. And we throw these words out a lot. So shame is an externally experienced emotion. It comes from interacting with other people. If you feel badly after someone mentions something, then that is shame, right? So this is what we experience in relationships with other people. Somebody points something else out, then we feel shame or sadness, and that's how we can apologize, right?
Brian has an issue with our pantry. Here's a good example of shame. I don't understand it and I don't care. So if he wants to keep our pantry clean, he can. So the kids go in and empty the dishwasher, which they're pretty good at doing. And one of his kids knows it bothers him. So he and I put all of the things in all the wrong places because we have Tupperware in there. And he will shame us for that. And because he's mad about it. So he shames us. And this is a fun thing. So I guess it's okay. And he knows we do it on purpose, but he comes like, I can't believe that you don't even know where to put everything. Why do you even empty the dishwasher? And I'm like, don't say that. I want them to empty it. So well, he
offered tours. I offered tours.
He did. He offered a tour of where to put the Tupperware,
right?
Which is exactly why I put it everywhere else. So
now,
that's a shaming.
My hope is that one day my son and wife will have guilt. Right? Yeah, guilt is a similar feeling, but generates internally. If you feel badly for something you have done, like misappropriately place Tupperware and their lids in the correct locations so that we can find them when they're needed, and you think, oh gosh, I feel badly that I've done this. This is a similar feeling to shame, but it is internally driven. You've created this all on your own. you can shame yourself and you can feel guilty about yourself and the things that you've done. So it's the good news is that your mom never guilt tripped you.
She shamed you.
She shamed you, right? So that's the bad thing. The good news is we don't guilt trip other people. Guilt tripping is only what you do inside. Like that's you packing your bags and going, I'm on a guilt trip.
Guilt is created in me because I've been shamed. So shaming someone actually creates that guilt, and it's left with that person to figure out how to get rid of. And that, and, we could come in and go, oh my gosh, we are so sorry that this happened. But that's us having to figure out how to get rid of our own guilt.
This is the new laser pointer function for your Apple users. That's Command L while you're doing a PowerPoint, so you don't have to follow my mouse. Here is our feeling grid again. Again, we're following the spectrum here: apathetic, hurt, lonely, depressed, ashamed, and guilty. These emotions, again, expressed, move into the third, tier. And where did I put something I was going to say there?
Down here.
Maybe it's just later. Okay, so I wanted to open up the floor to if there are any questions about sadness itself, trying to understand the emotion of sadness. Does anybody have a question that I can help try and clarify before we move on to hearing God's emotion?
Or any ahas. Yeah, an aha about something. That's fun too.
Right.
Okay, everybody gets it really well.
Great. You can save your questions for later then. Okay, so here we go. We're moving on to hearing God's emotion.
Right.
I was vacillating between a couple of different Psalms for us to use. Again, David is a man after God's own heart, which is where our emotions are, right? And so we want to understand God's emotions by understanding God's heart, and David is a man after God's own heart. But Psalm 142 is another excellent psalm that talks about crying out to God. And so I recommend that one. But I stuck with Psalm 22 because it was also something that was quoted by Jesus. So this is a much longer psalm. I'm just going to read this portion because I felt it pretty appropriate for talking about sadness. So I'm going to consult your intelligence and read to you. My God, why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far from saving me? So far from the words of my groaning. Oh my God, I cry out by day, but you do not answer by night, and I am not silent. Yet you are enthroned as the Holy One. You are the praise of Israel. In you our fathers put their trust. They trusted and you delivered them. They cried to you and were saved. In you they trusted and were not disappointed. But I am a worm and not a man, scorned by men and despised by the people. All who see me mock me. They hurl insults, shaking their heads. And this is probably only a third of the psalm, but David is so sad. So sad. This level of sadness and despair is known, which is why Jesus quotes this psalm on the cross. I'm pretty sure, I don't know if Jesus would have used the word, but I'm pretty sure he felt like a worm and not a man on the cross. That he was scorned and despised by the people. They mocked him, hurled insults, and shook their heads. If you don't believe that God listens, well, then you're not paying attention. Jesus listens. He hears. He quoted David on the cross because he understands it. I can't fathom a better way to prove that God listens to our sadness, and we need to cry out to him by day and by night when we are feeling that sadness, because he is sympathetic to our pain. I'm also really drawn by the perception that David is starting to communicate to God that he is a worm. Back to this spectrum of sadness, right? When we get sad, sometimes we feel ashamed, and that shame leads to feeling depressed. That depression leads us to feeling alone or lonely. That lonely allows us to be viewed and hurt by others. Sometimes we just pick up they're shaking their heads at us and say, oh, they're shaking their heads at me. I don't know if they were. But when we start to delve into our own sadness, when we get stuck in our sadness, we start to feel like a worm. I think in my Bible, it offered the other idea is that the idea of a worm came from the idea that he is garbage, that he is thrown out. So he must be a worm because that's what he's living in, this state of filth, spiritually, emotionally. So my own sadness, my own experiences with that is that I start to feel that worm, that less than, that just squishiness that is only used for bait for something better, like fishers of men. I just made that up in my head. But when we get depressed, we start to fall into a cycle of this depression. We start to use this against ourselves. We start to push down the shame, that guilt, the shame, the depression, the loneliness, the hurt, and then numbness. And that numbness becomes dangerous, especially in our relationships with God and our relationships with other people. Nobody loves me. Nobody cares about me. But we're not paying attention to all of it.
But you're saying that, I just had a thought. When you get sad, you start to feel like a worm, is what it sounds like David is saying. He's starting to feel, the word I always think of is worthless. Mm-hmm. And that's the one thing that I think that's my biggest goal with clients is I want them to feel worthy. Because if they can feel worthy, then they have purpose and joy. So
you've lost status as a man. Like, I'm a worm, not a man.
So as a man, you're like, I feel like a worm. But because I'm thinking, really, you feel like a worm? That's what sad is to you? And that is his. So that must mean it's different for other people. So if you're thinking, because I started to think while Brian was talking about this, I'm like, what is it about sad that we can't just lean into? Because we get mad and angry instead, right? So we put that feeling under and then we react with anger and mad. So for me, I know the reason that I go away from sad is because that's weak and
like a worm, no backbone.
So so for you, like, I guess it's the same kind of thing, but for me, I'm like, that is weak. I'm not going to be sad. In fact, I'm going to be even more opposite of that and definitely not joy because I'm having to prove something. So what is it that we fear? Why not be sad? Why do we go away from that? So I think you just kind of described why you go away from it. Does anybody know why they don't like the word sad? Like, why stay away from it?
I think it reveals a lot of, it could reveal some of my insecurities. And so I think whenever I become sad, then I become real with what's really going on. And so I think that can go into that scary category.
So you become kind of vulnerable to others in the sense of maybe, or feeling insecure, but sounds like a vulnerability too.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
Okay, cool. Not cool, but thanks for sharing. That was good. Anybody else kind of know what it is for them that they don't want to go into sad?
Okay, I think for me, sad, I can connect with what you were saying about not like feeling weak, because if you are angry, you're doing something active. If you're mad, you're doing something active. But if you're sad, it's like you're just like a lump.
Like a right log, yeah.
A worm.
Yeah, and so
like
you're not being proactive.
Right, like hanging out in a hammock. No, I'm kidding. Because y'all are in a hammock. That's good.
I
So
know. See, loving it.
you look happy in your hammock. You do.
Happy hammock.
Happy hammock. Is that the name? That's actually, Emily, that's pretty cool because that's kind of where I hit. I'm like, I don't want to be inactive. I don't want to not be productive. I don't want to like that create. So then I become too productive or more productive. And then I suck people into that too, to cover that up.
Right.
But
And sometimes
that's
that, and it's interesting you're talking about it, because I think we associate anger with a doing rather than
yeah.
sadness can be a doing or fear can be a doing. But a great line that I'd heard from a colleague and in my own counseling is that we're not human doings, we're human beings. And being sad is you at times.
And that's okay.
That's authentic, that's real. In fact, to the same way we think about vulnerabilities, we don't like vulnerabilities in ourselves, but we appreciate them and value them in other people. So that's the misconstrued idea of shame, of guilt and sadness, and we're holding on to that instead of actually crying out to God with our shame, crying out to God with our sadness, our fears.
I had one more thing.
Yeah.
I had one client, I had a client a long time ago say that she's like, why should I be sad? Like, why do you want me to cry? And I'm like, because then I know you're having emotion. So I'm really good when clients cry. But with her, she was like, what if I can't stop? Like, what if I can never stop? And I think that's a little bit of what you said, Sean, like the insecurity maybe. She's like, what if I don't stop? And then I kind of start to think about that in our faith. It's having faith. It's leaning into being sad because you are sad. And if you allow yourself to be sad, then you will stop.
Right. Emotions they don't work that way. There's a connection between mind and body. You can't feel a certain amount of physical pain that is from one extreme amount of pain for an extended period of time. It's impossible physically. And in the same way, it's impossible to experience the same intensity of emotion for an extended period of time. Now we can experience intensity and then experience intensity and experience intensity, which is what I would say happens when we use anger to cover up our sadness or our fears, because we didn't really resolve the sadness or the fear. And that anger is there, and then there's sadness again because we didn't resolve it, so that intensity is still there.
I was going to kind of piggyback on what Sean and Emily said, but for me, sadness is almost like falling into a hole, because it paralyzes. It takes so much energy to get out of it. Sometimes it's just easy to stay there, and it's one of those feelings I feel like that just is so hard to get out of, to change. And to me, it's like if you're in a hole, you try to crawl out, but you may go up a little bit, but then you fall back down. And so that's why for me, sadness is it's a scary emotion, I guess, just because you don't want to stay sad, and it's difficult to get out of it.
It is. And I think you can be sad for an extended period of time. There can be a depression. That's what that is.
I'm not saying that.
Yeah,
I'm saying the intensity.
The intensity can go up and down, like you were saying, but I lost my train of thought. But
You do feel stuck.
You feel stuck. But I was going to say, and some people are just. I believe that some people have more ability to be sad than others. Some people are just more melancholy than others. Like I think I asked you, I was like, do you ever just wake up heavy? He's like, no. I'm like, never? Like you just wake up heavy? And I'm like, I think I wake up with the heavy more than I don't. And so I think that's just part of me and having to figure that out.
But a Lifetime movie, man,
He's out.
I'm
like
tears all the time. So like Isabel will just look at me like, what's wrong with you? So I have no shame in that, but again, sometimes I'm not good as well at just getting to the expression of what's really going on deep inside of me. And the important thing I hope everybody hears is that's not the way that feelings work. They don't work. When you keep it, when you keep that feeling, that sadness, and you're in that hole, and then you don't do anything with that feeling, that is avoidance, that's under anger, and that's not really dealing and protecting yourself. The best way is to get out there and start using that emotion. It doesn't mean that you got to cry everywhere, invest in Kleenex stock. It just means that you have to start paying attention to the small parts, right? Paying attention to the small parts, you experience this, and oh gosh, this, I was so lonely, or this moment, gosh, I just recognized that I was all by myself and I had this moment of loneliness, which is different than being alone, because you can be in a crowd of people and still feel lonely. And that's the way I get in a crowd of people I don't know, that I start to feel lonely because I'm scared as well of opening up. When we start to express and open up about what we're feeling, it shifts out of that place. And that's what's important about, if you continue to read Psalm 22, it's on your list for this week, there's a change, there's a shift. What we have here in this psalm is, in this entire thing, is David is crying out to God and sharing his sadness, how badly he feels. And in the process of doing that, he becomes reminded of God's glory. There is a change that is interesting, because it says that he then begins to focus on God's love. The very next few parts, he begins to recognize that God has loved him before he was born and will do so after he is gone, that his love extends beyond this body. It is not a present thing, it is not a past thing or a future thing, it is an always has been thing. Because when we start to recognize and admit and own and sit in our emotion to be with it, well, then we also start to see the way out of what's going on with that. If you haven't seen, what's the name of that movie?
Is that Inside Out?
Inside Out, the Pixar movie about emotions. They stole my idea, those punks. You cannot have joy without sadness.
Mm-hmm.
The same way we can't understand pain and sin and love if we don't have the other things, the opposites of them.
You gotta struggle.
You gotta struggle. It is what we're called to do. Again, our emotions aren't righteous, but God knows that. He has been in it. My God, why have you forsaken me? Like, Jesus was abandoned and lonely on a cross. Thank goodness. He knows my loneliness. And when I open up, just the same way he cried out to his Father about what he was feeling, he was relieved, because that's the moment before he died. That's the moment before his pain ended. And the glory came as well. This shift, this total shift from sadness to joy in this psalm is perfect. And it lines up great with my feeling grid. So I'm going to promote that way too, because joy is the opposite of sadness. This is the progression that is naturally intended when we listen to what God offers. Sadness does not just go away, but in the relationship, and if we listen and we can hear and then feel and then understand, then we see the unexplainable joy. That's all it is. It's because we love and he loved, because we're paying attention to it. He's listening, and he gives us those other opportunities, and we get to listen to God back. That's what's important. So we're running short on time, and this was all we kind of had for today. So I was going to offer, I have some things that I could use to talk about emotion and what that expression of emotion looks like. But I wanted to just see if there are any other questions or comments or thoughts about sadness and how to use sadness with God and with other people.
I don't know, just maybe one thought, and maybe you guys can talk about this, but I know that in counseling sometimes, and even in my life, even growing up, family of origin type stuff, when sadness comes around, it almost seems like we need permission for that, and that's just not at times doesn't feel like a natural, at least for me, it doesn't feel like a natural thing. So when it hits, boy, it almost feels like it's been balled up for a long, long time. And so when the expression comes, or when that outlet comes, man, it just can feel pretty overwhelming at times if I'm not practiced at it. So I don't know if you guys have additional thoughts, but that's kind of where, when I think about sadness, that's where I go.
Yeah, I am. You talking about that kind of reminded me what I was thinking. It's similar with most of the with clients. Most of my clients, whenever they come in and they can't be sad and they don't know how to be sad and they're scared of it and they don't want to be sad, like it won't end or something, and it gets too deep, it's because they never ever saw it in anybody in their life. It happened, and then they never saw it. It wasn't role modeled, and then so that's like family of origin, right? I think. And then they didn't learn how to have the sadness, so they didn't see it. They don't know how to do it, and that makes it much more difficult. And so you do hold off and hold off and hold off, and then when you have it, it's just heavy, and you don't know how to get out of it because you've never seen the process through it. Does that make sense? It's just like, I always say, it's like seeing a tunnel coming up and you're like, I don't want to go in that tunnel. I'm going to go over the mountain. I'm going to go around the mountain. I'm going to go, find another way around and back up and down and through the trees. But if you just go through the tunnel and you're a little bit lost and you stay sad, you're going to get to the other side. The tunnel has to end. But we don't ever know how to make it end because we haven't seen it. So it's like a language. I mean, to me, it's just like a language. The more you see it and hear it, the better you are at it. But if you don't practice it and you don't allow yourself to have it, it becomes bigger when it does happen, because it's going to happen. Like, that's what I think. So I don't know if that's similar to what you were saying, Sean. It's just having the practice.
Absolutely. Yeah.
One of the ways I think about practicing is with the things that are inconsequential, right? The things that really don't matter. If you get up and somebody rearranged your Tupperware, like, oh my gosh, I'm so disappointed. Maybe I didn't teach them the tour of the Tupperware pantry part very well.
Just rude when
Or
you saw it that way.
maybe, paying attention to, oh, goodness, Texas Tech had this great job, or they didn't, because we're Texas Tech and we lose things all the time. So I understand sadness. I was also a Cubs fan in the 80s. So I know sadness and depression. But when we start paying attention and using those words, just even in our heads, then we become more versed in the language.
Yeah.
It's when the hard things happen and we're expecting to be great at it. No one's great at it. That's why we have other people around us. That's why I have a job. I don't want to have a job one day. That'd be awesome. But how great would it be when you walk into a restaurant, or no, not a restaurant, a retail store, and instead of being worried because you don't know where the belts are, and somebody comes up and says, can I help you find something? And you're like, no, that's fine. I'm fine. Instead of being worried that they are going to judge you because you don't know where the belts are, but they're the ones that put the belts in the place that it goes, that you could just say, I am so tired and don't know where the belts are. Could you just tell me where the belts are? And then you're just dealing with reality that they work there, they know where the belts are, and you don't have to leave disappointed because you couldn't find them. True story, and Eddie Bauer.
I bet that was a true story.
I was like, why would you put the belts by the coats? That makes no sense to me. We had a lecture at that point. So, any other questions or comments about sadness or experiences about sadness and expressing when you expressed your sadness and it worked? So I have one that's pretty great for me. It's one of my favorite stories with a bad, sad situation. Nearly 3 years ago, my mom passed away. And she was in the hospital for 40 something days. And I had to miss work a bunch of different times. And so we were doing a lot of counseling in nursing homes in the Austin area. And I canceled a lot of clients on a Monday, a couple different times. So all my clients knew that my mom was in the hospital. So the day she passed away was on a Monday. And so I missed work that day, and they knew that I wasn't there. It's probably because I was visiting my mom. So then the following Monday, after she had passed, I went to work, and I had 10 clients that day in 2 different nursing homes. And every single client asked how my mom was, because they knew that I wasn't there last week. They didn't know that she had passed away. So 10 times I had to tell the story of my mom passing away. 10 times. And this was a weird time in our lives. Susan and I got the great idea that we should sell the house, and it sold in 2 hours for cash, which means we had to move out in 2 weeks. So then we moved into a camper in the backyard of our office building, which we'd lived in for 4 days before my mom passed. And so a week later, I come home and like stuff is flying out the door of the camper. And I'm like, what's going on? And Susan's like, we're going to remodel this thing on the inside. I'm like,
That's how I deal with my sadness, by the way.
today? So I love doing stuff with her, but so it didn't matter. But I realized that was not a really good day for me. And so everyone's all talkative. Susan's super chatty, and the kids hadn't seen me all day. And so I just looked at everybody and said, listen, guys, I've had to explain. I had 10 clients today. I've had to explain this 10 times, my mom dying. I don't want to get angry at any of you. And I'm just really, really sad right now. And I don't want to not be around you. So if you just tell me what to do and what to throw away or move over there, that'd be great. I just don't expect me to talk right now. And Susan's like, great, pick that up and throw that away. Like, she just sent me right to work.
What did I say though? What I said was, I'm like, that is great, because apparently I'm not dealing with things very well because I'm renovating a camper. And I just looked at him and I said, thank you for telling me where you are. Is this where you want to be? And is there anything else I can do? So it just opened the door to communicate and talk about where he was and become aware of where I was, and then just let him be and take care of him. And so taking care of him was just, so I didn't tell him to do a ton of stuff, but he wanted to be a part of it. And so it just helped.
My experience was about 30 minutes later, having been sad and allowed to be sad, and then comforted by being present with me and not me just going off by myself to be sad or getting angry at them because they're bothering me because I'm sad, is that I became pretty talkative after that. Really engaged, really wanting to just talk. And we weren't talking about those things. We even talked about my mom later. You know, it became a way of being able to heal by acknowledging that this was present. So next week we are going to cover scared. Again, if you guys have questions for us, you can certainly email those to us and we can try and address them with you personally, but also in the session, and our sessions have been pretty good.
And I would just suggest while you're reading, if you're reading the Bible or anything actually, but for us, we're kind of going through John with the kids right now. And so as we read,
Mark.
I'm sorry, we're going through Mark. And so as we read it, I go, hey, look. And I looked over at Brian, I was like, Jesus got angry. So you see, you're talking about the feelings, you have the feelings in mind. And so then you start to see more personality and you connect more with the people in the Bible because you're so attuned to those feelings. So my homework or fun for you is if you are reading, just if you do notice something like that and you notice sadness or you notice anger, you notice an emotion about somebody that you wouldn't have noticed before because we've talked about the words and they're in your head, just share that with us next week. So that would be fun.
Be great.
All right, y'all have a good week. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.